This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Richard Gamble his new book, In Search of the City on a Hill, The Making and Unmaking of an American Myth. Professor Gamble holds the Anna Margaret Ross Alexander Chair in History and Political Science at Hillsdale College. He also is the author of The War for Righteousness, Progressive Christianity, the Great War, and the Rise of the Messianic Nation, and The Great Tradition, classic readings on what it means to be an educated human being. He also serves as a contributing editor to the American Conservative. Professor Gamble, welcome to Liberty Law Talk.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a privilege to be with you today.
Glad to have you. Professor Gamble, I wanted to ask you at the outset, and maybe this is a way to talk about why you wrote this book. You start with a speech of former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown addressing a special session of the United States Congress in 2009. It's March, 2 months after the inauguration of President Obama. We're in the trough of the financial recession. And he speaks to Congress in tones that kind of evoke American greatness, American exceptionalism, and reminding America kind of its strength as a nation, even though there's this difficult time we're going through. And you quote him, he says, America is a shining city upon the hill, end quote. You also quote him as saying, America is not just the indispensable nation. You are the irrepressible nation. Why did you start this book with Brown and this speech and this occasion?
I started with former Prime Minister Brown because I was so struck by the fact that a foreign observer of America sounded just like an American. He almost sounded like a parody of the American image in the world. To invoke the city on a hill, in fact, to invoke the shining city on a hill, which is the Reagan trademark of that phrase, made him sound like a promoter of the American image. He spoke the way an American statesman would speak or an American politician would speak, and I have found that remarkable. And I also cite the example of the Australian Prime Minister saying virtually the same thing about America. So it showed me in a very quick way, it showed me and showed my reader, I hope, that the city on a hill is not just an identity, a tagline, a slogan that Americans now use about themselves, but it has become so well known, so inseparable from the American identity, that visiting dignitaries speaking to Congress use the phrase, invoke the phrase, because to them it also is part of the American image in the world.
I wanted to ask you, so we know the ultimate origin of this phrase, city on a hill, is from the Gospel of Matthew, specifically from the Sermon on the Mount. Christ is saying to his disciples, you are a city on a hill, a light that cannot be hid. How does it come to these shores, to this continent? This is a huge part of your book, of just historical recovery, historical memory of the phrase and the origins of it. Describe that for us, if you will.
Sure. That's a core question, as you identify it. That's a core question, at least in the first part of the book, to trace what is an unlikely story, a story of borrowing that never actually had to happen. This is one of the things I try to do as a historian. This is what I've learned from some of the best historians, that it's important to tell the story we're telling about the past in an open-ended way, to recover this sense that it could have turned out a different way. And I came to understand that there was nothing inevitable about America starting to talk about itself with a phrase taken, as you said, out of the Gospel of Matthew. So I worked pretty hard to reconstruct that story, or I like your word very much, to recover that. And this is an act of recovery of memory. And it turns out that that phrase comes to us, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, it comes to us through John Winthrop, the Puritan leader back in 1630. And he used it in a fairly unremarkable way. This is the other thing that I learned early on in this process. He used it in a way that was fairly conventional among the Puritans, among the English, among the Christians of his generation, to say that a Christian community, sometimes the church itself, narrowly defined, sometimes a particular congregation as a city on a hill, an example to others, but also sometimes used in a slightly more secular way to describe an actual town, an exemplary town in England, as a model for other Christians, for other believers. And John Winthrop worked this into his speech at the very end and told the Puritan community that would found a colony in the Massachusetts Bay Area that the world would be watching them. The eyes of the world would be upon them, in that famous phrase, that they would, for good or evil, good reputation or bad reputation, they would be conspicuous in the eyes of the world. Whether they succeeded or failed, they would be a standout. They would have the eyes on them as a city on a hill, and they had to live up to what was expected of them, and primarily what God himself expected them to achieve in the new world.
So John Winthrop, writing this, clearly believes there is something of a divine mission that the Puritans have to accomplish when they arrive on the new continent. So they believe, there is this kind of belief of they're God's agents in history, furthering the kingdom of God. Let me ask you, in the model of Christian charity that Winthrop writes, what are his ideas about political order, political economy, social order, et cetera? Are we able to, does it bridge, say, both the kingdom of God or the city of God and the city of man in this sermon?
Understanding the fuller purpose, the fuller intention of the model of Christian charity, even understanding what that complicated title means, is really the key to the document, to Winthrop, to the Puritan mission, and we get distracted by the city on a hill phrase at the end. And we could probably come back to this in our conversation. This is one of the things that hit me very hard as I was doing this research. It is only in retrospect, it is only in later generations that we come to think of the phrase city on a hill as the defining phrase, what that speech is all about. In fact, some books call it Winthrop's city on a hill speech, and that would surprise him. If you read the speech in its entirety, it is a speech exactly as your question suggests. It's a speech about political order, about political community. Now, I'm not suggesting it is an entirely political speech. Winthrop himself would wonder what we meant by that. It's about how a Christian community ought to conduct itself in the world. And really, for him, for Winthrop, as he draws upon key passages of the Old Testament to describe Israel, as he draws upon key passages of the New Testament that describe the conduct, the ethic of the church, he applies the ideal of Israel and the ideal of the church as the ideal for his own Puritan community in the New World. So he emphasizes the bonds of brotherhood. And before that, one of the most surprising things in this document, when people read it for the first time, is that he begins with an assertion of social hierarchy. He's very much a man of his time. He was part of the elite, part of the landed gentry in England. Not nobility, but part of the landed gentry in England. And he begins with a bald assertion that it is God's will for human society to be divided into ranks. But those ranks have duties, responsibilities, to care for each other, to serve each other. And he draws on this rich language from the Old and the New Testament to charge the Puritan community to love one another, to care for one another, to uphold for one another, to provide for one another in times of great need and necessity. He calls, at least once in the speech, he calls the Puritans a community of peril. So they are facing a hard time in the wilderness. They are about to face a hard time in the wilderness of New England. They are going to carve out a life for themselves out of the woods. They are going to be surrounded by potential enemies, not just the Indian tribes, but potentially the French and so on. They're in a hostile world. And so he urges them to care for one another, really as an outpost of the body of Christ in the New World.
I was going to ask you, you talk about we have no historical data we can point to that he actually delivered this publicly. Particularly, I mean, it's often said he delivers this on board the ship Arbella. One can think of, the winds buffeting the Puritans and hearing this sermon and being roused to action, et cetera. But we don't know really what happens with it in terms of the public delivery of it. I was going to ask you, in the Massachusetts colony and in succeeding generations, and in large measure, as you note, this notion of divine calling that the Puritans possess will continue in further generations. Jonathan Edwards appeals to this as well. Other Puritan divines do. I wanted to ask, though, would people have pulled this out and read it? Would they have studied it? Would it have been taught in, say, the local, the schools of education at the time, or was it something kind of implicit in the way they did things?
Yes, and your question is very nuanced, and I'm glad the way you asked that, because it does take that kind of care. One of the interesting things about the model of Christian charity, and I'm sorry that historians often have to be the spoil sport and rain on everybody's parade, but the model of Christian charity itself seems to have been completely unknown, unremarked upon by the first generation of Puritans. And there's one small exception to that that I won't go into, but it disappeared among the Winthrop family papers. And for 208 years, that speech did not see the light of day. It was not published until the 19th century. Now, that doesn't mean that the ideas were in a box somewhere, because other Puritan leaders, as would have been the habit of the time, certainly referred to the settlements, the cluster of settlements in New England, as city or cities upon a hill, using that same admonition that John Winthrop used to encourage, to instruct their people to be on their guard against the temptations of Satan and the world and of materialism, and to be sure that they fulfilled their mission. So the idea of mission is widespread. It is present there. In the first generation, it's even more present by the time we get to the third generations. Men like Cotton Mather later and his famous Histories of New England, a very strong sense of purpose, of a purpose-driven people, we might say. And John Winthrop himself brings that up in other ways, in a very strong way, a way I find almost overwhelming in the model of Christian charity. Now, you ask about education of generations of New Englanders, and there is a way that John Winthrop is part of that formation of future generations. In fact, his diary, his very important, historically very significant diary, was well known to generations while the model of Christian charity remained completely unknown. So when we read, as we do here at Hillsdale, when we read excerpts from his diary, a part called His Little Speech on Liberty, that was extremely well known to New Englanders. That was often reprinted. That was read by Alexis de Tocqueville when he was studying the New England character and the Puritans. So there are parts of the Winthrop legacy, there are parts of the American sense of mission that are handed down by the Puritans generation after generation. My concern was, and one of the surprises I encountered was we in the modern times, we in the 20th and 21st century, we pack all that meaning into the model of Christian charity. We pack all of that Redeemer Nation identity, as it was called years ago. We go back and pack it into a document that was not known at all. In fact, we do more than that. We pack that Redeemer Nation identity into one part of one sentence in a document that went unread. So that's the thing that's fascinating to me, and I think it has created what we could actually call a false memory about how these ideas are transmitted over the generations.
So the argument Americans have not remembered well or have taken, as you argue, it's not even the content of ideas, but what do we do with the ideas, or what do we do with them in our own collective capacity? I wanted to ask. I mean, there's also this part of your look or your investigation into this is how do we conceive of our settlement as a nation, and are we a nation fundamentally defined by the Puritans and their understanding, or are there separate foundings or separate ways of thinking about the American identity? I was going to ask, so you say it really goes nowhere for 200 and something years. How does it get revived? Is this a revival with America's increasing muscularity in the late 19th century, or does it come later?
I think that happens in stages as Americans first have the ability to know the document and then actually do something with it. And I wish I could claim that I have the definitive answer for how this document entered the American consciousness. What I can claim, the farthest my research, and I try to be as diligent as possible in archives in Boston and New York and Washington, as far as my research can take me, available research, I can say when it was first published, and that was in 1838. It was published by the Massachusetts Historical Society. I know where it sat in the archives. It sat where it still sits in the archives in New York City at the New York Historical Society. They are the owners of the only early copy of that document. And I think I know when this document was first reprinted, and I think I know when it was first quoted in a history book, and that was by the towering figure, the dean of American historians in the 19th century, George Bancroft. And he added pieces of the model of Christian charity in a later edition of Volume 1 of his massive History of the United States. So when that document was available in print, he owned a copy of it. Bancroft owned a copy of it in print. And along the way, it took him maybe 2 decades to make this decision. Along the way, he added long passages from it in his own history. And what strikes me about that, and you can track the history, it would be tedious to even to read in detail about all the historians who made use of this, because it tells a fairly mundane story. They began quoting parts of the model of Christian charity, but what I found most interesting is that historians rarely quoted the phrase city on a hill. They quoted the sections about loving one another, caring for one another. They quoted the first paragraph about God ordaining classes and hierarchy in society. They quoted sections about economics, but they never quoted the city on a hill passage. So it took a long, long time for Americans to get in the habit, first of reading the document, of quoting the document, and then to get in the habit of narrowing that document's meaning down to the city on a hill. And that's really a product of the second half of the 20th century. And then there's another story, and maybe we could follow up on this, then there's another story of how it makes its way from the history books into political speech.
Yeah, so let's get into the transformation of the metaphor. So we have a biblical teaching, we have a theological metaphor transformed into a very earthly political metaphor, and you document this in the book, happening you said this happens in the 20th century. Specifically, you locate two academics, Samuel Eliot Morison and Perry Miller. Perry Miller taught at Harvard. And if I remember correctly, he was a professor of John Kennedy's when he attended Harvard. Is that correct?
Right. Kennedy may have taken a course with him, and there are historians and biographers who say that. You can look at Kennedy's Harvard transcript online from the Kennedy Library, and I can find no trace of him having actually taken a course with Perry Miller. But that might be true. It might just be something that I'm not aware of, but I can't document that.
And so these men, Morrison and also Miller, you write about their recovery of the city on a hill and their own light and understanding it in a different way. I was going to ask you, so why is it fundamentally wrong to make this transformation? And I was also wanted to ask you as a follow-up, could there not be something implicit in Winthrop's metaphor or in his sermon, in the larger ideas in the sermon that opens it up to this transformation?
Right. Let me handle the second part of that question first. There is indeed something in Winthrop himself and in the Puritans' political use of the Bible that indeed opens the metaphor of the city on a hill to radical transformation. I am not saying that they deserve all the blame, but they handle the metaphor in such a way, they bring it down to earth in such a way, or they transfer it from the church to civil society in such a way that it makes it very, very easy for later generations to abuse it. Let me backtrack one bit, if I may. When we look at the history of interpretation of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where this phrase comes from, for 1,500 years, we see no evidence of anyone making political use of that city on a hill. That is about, even more narrowly than the church, it's about the teaching ministry of pastors. It's about the disciples and their teaching ministry. So the generation of the 16th century, 17th century takes that and applies it, as I mentioned earlier, to an earthly community. Certainly in a community of Christians, but still an earthly community. Now, Winthrop does that in a very breezy way. He just makes his way from the Bible, from instructions to the church, into instructions for an earthly community. In some ways, that might seem admirable. That might seem very idealistic. And wouldn't we want to live in a world in which everyone treated his neighbor as a fellow Christian within the body of Christ? Well, but then we can also see some problems with that, especially as America becomes a more complicated place. When we aren't living in a Puritan community anymore where everyone's a member of the same church, we have to figure out what that metaphor could possibly mean if it's applied to a civil society. And as a historian, I am primarily an observer. I strive to be a faithful observer of what people said and did. So the historian part of me does not render a judgment that they were abusing the metaphor of the city on a hill. But I'm more than a historian, and I wrote this book for more than historical reasons. And I wrote it out of concern as an American citizen, and I also wrote it out of concerns I have as a Christian. I'm troubled, and I think this is where we have arrived in 2012. I'm troubled by just how secularized the city on a hill metaphor has become. I think it has become so closely identified with the American nation and the American sense of mission that if it hasn't reached this point yet, it is at risk of losing all of its identification with the church. And this was a test case for me of showing how biblical language can become radically secularized and politicized. And to me, that ought to be of concern for Christians of all kinds. It ought to be of concern for evangelical Christians, conservative Christians, for Catholics, for others who are likely to stand up for America, to be very proud of America and its accomplishments, and are maybe inclined to defend the political use of the city on a hill. But I'd like to see Christians who read this book pause and think a little more carefully about what happens to the identity of the church when America or any nation state takes on even part of that identity. So I try to work out in the book a delicate story of gain and loss. America might have gained something by taking on this powerful metaphor, but the church has ultimately lost something by surrendering that city on a hill identity. And it leads to a profound confusion between the city of God and the city of man, between the work of the church and the work of the state.
Let me ask you so in connecting the transformation of the metaphor, you note the academics we previously mentioned, Perry Miller being one, who begins to write and use the phrase in scholarship after World War II.
Right.
And then you note, so we have two presidents who make use of the phrase, President John F. Kennedy and also President Ronald Reagan. Kennedy first evokes the phrase, if I remember from your book, in a speech he gives to the Massachusetts General Assembly before departing to become the president.
Right.
And then we'll also make subsequent use of the phrase. And of course, Reagan as well, I think this holds, there is a context, and the context being the Cold War, the context being an America that needs to understand itself, I think, with a very powerful moral identity in the face of Soviet communism, and in the face of, and we can look back and say perhaps there was a rush to judgment in the early day, or in the 1960s and this part of the Cold War. But if you're in that time, if you're in that moment, you look across and you see a very powerful foe that is opposed to virtually everything America stands for. Why would it have been wrong in that situation for Kennedy to evoke this phrase for the purpose of summoning Americans, calling Americans to a national moral civic identity and being proud of their institutions? And also likewise Reagan comes, this is the common historical judgment of the 1970s, a decade that many regard with some degree of embarrassment on the part of America and a lot of things that this country did, or say even a paralyzed nation. Reagan is something different, and he is evoking different strains of the American experience, and the City on the Hill is one of those strains he wants to touch on, and he uses it much more so than Kennedy, you note. And Reagan, in doing this, though, seems to, on balance, have achieved something worthwhile, namely America, almost an American Renaissance in the 1980s. So I guess my question to you is, could there not be a use of the phrase that is not unbound, but actually one that calls Americans to, say, their best light?
That's a vital question, and we could ask that about other biblical phrases that have made their way into the American lexicon. When Lincoln says that a house divided against itself will not stand, that's another deploying of the Bible, biblical language for urgent political ends. So that's going to happen, and especially for a biblically literate nation, as America has been over the centuries, that is going to happen, and nothing I ever say will even slow that down, I don't think. And I acknowledge that the political use of these kinds of phrases, these highly evocative phrases that reach something very deep within us, those uses can be shrewd, they can be effective, they can work. And I would never say that Reagan or Kennedy had bad motives in adopting this phrase, or that they intended to empty a biblical metaphor of its meaning. In the same way, I would never think that when Lincoln said the gates of hell would not prevail against American democracy, that he was somehow deliberately attacking the church. But what I think is important for us to recognize is the unintended consequences, and history is littered with unintended consequences. Whatever the motivation might have been, no matter how pressing the need might have been at the moment, especially in the 1980s, for both a domestic renaissance and for a reassertion of American integrity overseas, that something still happened to that metaphor. We did something to it as we handled it and as we appropriated it for new uses. And when we look at the metaphor now, and I also try to document this, it's become ubiquitous now. I think we see metaphor exhaustion by this point, by 2012. We see a metaphor that has been used and overused and stretched and stretched and stretched to now where I don't think it means much of anything anymore about the American identity. And yet it is so prevalent that we are at risk of forgetting where it ever came from in the first place.
It seems to me one theme that that bothers us or should bother us is there is this kind of temptation to arrogance with the use of the
right.
phrase, and a belief that America has everything to offer and really nothing to learn from the world, particularly say our Western civilization or European civilization, and so that should bother us. There's also, I think, a millenarian streak potentially in the use of the phrase of that somehow we can actually plant free markets and liberal democracies in other places through a lot of different means. I was going to ask you previously in the show. I talked with George Nash about the book that he edited of Herbert Hoover's, which was Hoover's dissection of the New Deal and also of President Roosevelt's foreign policy in World War II, and then after in the post-war summits. Hoover had a notion of, I would say, American exceptionalism very strongly. It was not I'll say a forward American exceptionalism, one that sought to create outposts. But it was, he used the phrase, I don't think city on a hill, but light of liberty to the world, that this was America's best use of her strength, of her achievements, was to actually fulfill them and then and make them available to others, but not using the military and not even using a very powerful foreign policy. Is that perhaps a middle way or a median way to retain a moralized, mission-driven national purpose, but one that's not, say, unbound?
Right. I think that's an important distinction, and Hoover might be a good place to go to help think about a different kind, a more constrained, more historically grounded kind of American exceptionalism. And George Nash is a very gifted scholar and a very close student of Herbert Hoover, and he's exactly right. Hoover repeatedly starting in the 1920s, and then with his, as he grappled with FDR and the New Deal, he repeatedly talked about the American system and distinguished it from European state socialism and then from European fascism, and he feared that America was squandering what had made it unique economically, politically, culturally, that we were sacrificing the very things that made America America. And he might use a phrase like light of liberty, but I don't recall him using a great deal of, he will use some biblical language, as any politician in America would, but he doesn't overly spiritualize, doesn't make America messianic. In contrast to Franklin Roosevelt, if anybody goes back and reads some of his speeches, including his first inaugural, when he talks about chasing the money changers from the temple, and he will use language from the Bible that is about Jesus Christ himself to describe America and the New Deal. It's really quite remarkable, and there's something fairly shameless about it. But Hoover does speak to is what I said before, to a more constrained, historically situated American exceptionalism that focuses on the achievements of the American founding, on our institutions, on our economic institutions. And I think that is something that could unite Americans, that we could go back and be proud of the distinctiveness, indeed the uniqueness of the American achievement, something which the founding generation was very clear about. America was meant to escape Europe's folly and Europe's tragedy. And we can still focus on that. What makes America America? And we can do that in a way that doesn't lead into messianic delusions about redeeming the world, about universalizing the American mission. We can do it in a way that is morally responsible, that recognizes, respects the boundary between church and state, and doesn't appropriate a great deal of heavy biblical language to justify who we are and what we do.
No, and as I was reading your book, I think this also could refocus what we think American exceptionalism is around things that are truly exceptional about our country, like the art of association, religious liberty, the ways of dealing with, as Tocqueville called it, democracies, despotisms, and these kind of leveling tendencies that happen within a democratic society. And we could focus on the ways, these unique ways America evolved, created, has practiced to deal with those tensions, which in many respects are not a part of a lot of you'll say center-right political rhetoric, which is very nationalized, I think, in a lot of ways, and looks to a 100% solution to a problem, rather than looking back into our own exceptional history and thinking of ways that prior ways of mediating tension. In the end, something that I was going to ask you. It seems you mentioned earlier those who would want to retain City on a Hill because the alternative is, and it seems to me the alternative is either let's say a progressive application, or even something like realism, that the focus of America, both domestically and internationally, is something like just maintaining a balance or maintaining a stasis of forces to ensure just a decent life or a decent adjustment, which I think leaves people cold and unsatisfied, particularly a lot of people who have kind of rallied around the City on a Hill idea. What do you think of that problem? And is there something like realism? Does that need to be applied more and more to counter these problems, or is there other solutions?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on foreign policy, and I doubt anyone should take my advice on this. But I have given it some thought, and there is a part of realism that I find very attractive. I think it insults the American people when our presidents on down assume that we can't handle tough talk about the reality of life in a dangerous, complicated world. I think the American people could handle more talk of our economic interests in the world, our security in the world. I'm not sure it always has to be dressed up in a lot of ideologically loaded language with a lot of isms and capital letter words. That frustrates me when I hear our politicians doing that, and I do believe it's an insult to the intelligence of the American people. But you're right. There is a coldness to realism that I don't think will ever connect with the American people. We are an outgoing people. We are an optimistic people. We are a persevering people. We take our ideals seriously and our achievements seriously, our achievement of ordered liberty very seriously. And it would be a mistake for our policymakers and our politicians to try to craft a rhetoric that had none of that idealistic language. So I think it would resonate. The idea of exceptionalism is so deep in our history, is so deep in our character as a people, that perhaps the right thing to do is to revive a more historically responsible, I'll use the word again, a more grounded, a more earthbound understanding of what has made us different as a people, what we should be proud of in our achievement, and what we have to offer the world as an example of successful self-government and limited government. And those are potent ideals that our politicians could appeal to without floating off into these abstractions, which at best are empty, but at worst lead Americans to delusions about themselves that somehow we are invincible, that somehow we are not subject to the limits on power and resources, and that we carry around this get-out-of-jail-free card in the world, which we simply do not. And as the world becomes an even more dangerous place, if it does, Americans will have to understand the hard choices that face them. They will have to face the hard choices of borrowing, debt, and high taxes. And that reality check will have to be carefully managed, I think rhetorically managed by our politicians, and still appeal to American values, to American traditions, and even to a brand of American exceptionalism.
Professor Gamble, I think that's really a perfect way to end. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's been a real privilege to be with you today.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.